Okay, so Matt Dillahunty and Dinesh D'Souza recently had a debate or a quote-unquote discussion regarding religion and belief in God. However, for a brief moment, they actually dove into climate change, and that's what I want to discuss. Per usual, my bullshit detector was going off the rails as Dinesh D'Souza made his various fallacies and demonstrably false claims. While Dillahunty did a great job in catching the logical fallacies, he wasn't equipped to catch D'Souza's false statements. While it's likely D'Souza doesn't know a lick more about climate change than Dillahunty, what he does have is a template of arguments that, to unpack, either require expertise in climate change, or at least a basic level of knowledge plus some experience with these talking points. And that's where I come in. I get the sense Dinesh knows his arguments are nonsense but doesn't care, because, from his point of view, the ends justify the means. He is ideologically opposed to regulation of the energy sector, and so for him, misleading people on the science behind climate change is a justifiable means. By the way, I thought I'd use some excerpts from Potholer 54's videos, where he also refutes climate change denial arguments, since D'Souza uses many of the same arguments. I have linked to Potholer 54's playlists in the description, along with a couple of suggested books. But if you can't bring yourself to read a couple of books, at the very least, watch the videos in this playlist. You'll note the different tone when someone is legitimately trying to explain climate change as opposed to the rhetorical tricks you get from the deniers. Speaking of D'Souza, he is displaying the new form of denial. He'll purport to believe what climate change researchers have shown, but then go on to describe a very truncated version of what they have in fact shown. In any case, let's get to it.
Well, I mean, here we are on common ground. If you're talking about science, if you're talking about quantum physics, if you're talking about relativity, if you're talking about the Big Bang, if you're talking about evolution, we have nothing to argue about. I'm on board with you 100%.
Hang on, you included science in that.
Science, yes. I'm on board
Does that
with...
include climate change science?
Climate change is, at least in the public sense it's understood, in no way science.
Okay, we'll probably...
Okay, so there it is. The dishonest tactic of reframing what he means by climate change. This way, he can ignore what climatologists are telling us and deflect the focus to some undefined version of climate change.
We'll get back to that afterwards.
We can come back to that, but it is in no way science.
I'm not a climate scientist.
No,
so it's...
I mean, I am on board 100% with the science of the greenhouse effect. When people say 97% of scientists, and you actually look at what 97% of scientists believe, they believe in the greenhouse effect. And the greenhouse effect is simply basically saying the release of carbon into the atmosphere warms the atmosphere. You'll get no disagreement from me on that.
Actually, the metric is that 97% of climatologists agree that climate change is real and that humans are contributing to it. It's important to point out that it's climatologists because they're the subject matter experts. It doesn't matter what a biologist thinks about climate change any more than it matters what a climatologist thinks about DNA.
Now, there are several other propositions that are married to that, I think, smuggled under the carpet. Things like human beings are the primary cause of these differences. Second of
No, it's not smuggled in. That's part of the consensus.
all, the best way to tackle them is to change ultimately the temperature of the Earth in various ways that we could try to affect through human behavior.
Your objection is, and we'll get back to God like right after this. I don't know how far apart we are, and I have no expertise there, but it seems that your objection is primarily about how much are we the cause, what can we potentially do about it, what are the potential solutions, less so than what's happening.
Well, I mean, look, yeah, normally if I walk out and it's really hot, there are two possibilities. One is I can try to change the outdoor temperature, right? The other is I can take off my jacket.
And there it is again. He is reframing this to a situation where the cause of hotter temperatures is external, and the consequences of this heat are that we may have to remove our jacket. The reality is that we are changing global temperatures through our CO2 emissions and that this is already resulting and will continue to result in droughts, famines, resource wars, extinctions, and an increase in frequency and severity of things like hurricanes, floods, and forest fires.
Those are two ways to respond to the same phenomenon.
Unless you're a polar bear.
Unless you're a polar bear. Now, there's a woman who counts the number of polar bears on the Earth, and she has nothing to do with climate change. She did a report a couple of years ago saying there are more polar bears walking on the Earth than ever. The polar bear population has multiplied. Now, right away she finds herself in controversy. Why? Not because the counting is wrong. It's difficult to count polar bears, admittedly, but she's the best one doing it in the world. But the reason she's controversial is it's not supposed to be the case. The glaciers are supposed to be melting, the habitat's changing, the polar bears disappearing. So the very fact that there are all these polar bears thriving and running around is like a major embarrassment. And so you have to dump on her and attack her. But even though she's giving you a valuable piece of data, scientific data, that bears upon the truth of this hypothesis. The hypothesis is that the Earth is getting hotter.
Okay, so D'Souza's source here is a blog post from 2008. In these subsequent 12 years, we now know that polar bear numbers are dwindling on the coasts where the ice is melting. They are beginning to starve and they are moving inland, where they are coming into greater contact with humans. This is not good for either humans or the bears, but it's far worse for the bears since we humans are the ones with the guns. Nevertheless, here is Potola54 addressing that very blog post when someone else used it in their climate change denial video.
The polar bears are dying off.
Okay. So what?
Truth. There are possibly more of these soulless killing monsters on Earth today than ever, certainly since we've begun monitoring them.
What's that got to do with the issue of whether the Earth is warming, whether carbon dioxide is the cause, and whether it'll cause stronger hurricanes, increased salination, droughts and floods, and sea level rise, and acidification of the oceans, and fewer coral reefs and more coastal erosion? These are the myths you're supposed to be busting. But okay, let's take a look anyway. Crowder tells us to go to his website for his source, which I did. It's a blog called factcheck.org. It says there has indeed been a rise in polar bear numbers since the 1970s, due mainly to legislation banning polar bear hunting. And it also says many scientists believe that due to climate change and resulting environmental factors, the trend is reversing. Now remember, this is Crowder's source, and funnily enough, he never mentioned any of this. Crowder's other source from which he got this graph is, of course, another blog. The blogger thinks numbers may be increasing, and she could be right. My policy is not to believe everything I read in blogs. But both of Crowder's sources agree on one thing: we simply don't know for sure. That's not my assessment. I haven't got a clue either. That's the assessment of the blogs Crowder cites. So despite his revealed truth that polar bear numbers are increasing, we can chalk that myth down to don't know. And as far as the question of whether carbon dioxide is the cause of global warming is concerned, the number of polar bears is totally irrelevant.
Now think of it. The Earth is getting hotter by a degree or so Celsius over 100 years.
To be clear, most of that increase has occurred in the last few decades, and we are on track to raise the temperature a few more degrees over the next several decades. Even if we are successful at capping this increase to another 2 degrees, this warming will still have many negative consequences, but they will be less severe than what we'd get with a higher increase in global average temperatures.
And this is measured by things, in effect, putting thermometers in the ocean, which depend upon how far the thermometers are from the coastline, what the level of the ocean is at the and these measurements.
That's a very small subset of how oceanic temperatures are recorded. He is omitting other measurements including land surface temperatures, as well as both upper and lower atmospheric temperatures. He's omitting that we also have countless satellites and weather stations to track weather patterns. In addition to this, we have other indicators like migration patterns, oceanic acidification, sea levels and melting ice sheets that are all converging on the same conclusion.
Are then modeled, in other words, put into computer programs to generate conclusions.
These data sets are being tabulated by various agencies including NOAA, NASA and the Japanese Meteorological Agency, and they are coming to the same conclusions. So unless you're willing to argue that alien lizard people are controlling various agencies, not to mention the world's science organizations, as well as the various national academies of science, this is kind of hard to simply scoot under the rug.
Which ultimately have massive implications for the world economy.
Do you know what really has massive implications for the world economy? Coastal flooding wiping out trillions of dollars of assets and damaging if not destroying certain industries. An agriculture industry that becomes unreliable because seasonal changes become less predictable. Famines, droughts and resource wars. Those things have massive implications for the world economy, not to mention human suffering and loss of life.
So what I'm getting at is, there are people who are asking us to change our way of life because of a 1 degree move in the climate.
No, because we are on a trajectory that will warm the planet by several degrees, and this will be disastrous.
Now, my view on climate change is this. I watch the people who say this to see how serious they are about it. The very people who say this.
There's your mistake.
And here it is. Never mind what climatologists, and for that matter the military is telling us in regards to what climate change will mean. D'Souza is going to rant about people like Mike Bloomberg as if the reality of climate change depends on what Mike Bloomberg does, but here is the thing. Rich people, like Mike Bloomberg, have less skin in this game than the average person. Why? Because rich people like Bloomberg can live wherever they want. They won't be affected by the loss in agriculture because they can pay whatever it costs to get food. Okay, so some of their investments may take a hit, but they can move their money around and find something else that's profitable.
Well, for example, I look at Mike Bloomberg. Mike Bloomberg owns, I believe, 11 homes.
Can we stop looking at Mike Bloomberg? Because those ads are everywhere. Like, I got to Times Square, and it's like every time I turn Mike Bloomberg.
But I'm just saying, here's a guy who says it's going to be a priority for him as president. And I would say, really, if you have 11 homes, shouldn't you go down to 7? Well, if you really thought that your carbon imprint is a little too big.
I would completely agree with you there, but Mike's hypocrisy isn't really relevant to what the data show.
Are we talking about the hypocrisy of everybody? Because...
No, I'm talking about what the data show.
Okay, here's the data. Everyone can see this data, okay?
But which data? The simplified straw man version people like D'Souza peddle to their audience, or the actual data, which admittedly, isn't as easily accessible or digestible as it should be.
Now the Obamas, who are major apostles of this data, just bought a $12 million house right on the ocean, right on the water in Martha's Vineyard.
Okay.
These are the same people who are saying that in 12 years or 10 years, Miami will be engulfed by the ocean. The oceans are going to rise and swamp coastal properties, right?
Yes, because the Obamas are rich, and want to spend some time in the place they've been renting during the summers. This isn't the place they have to live. They can live pretty much anywhere they want. When the tides rise high enough they can move, assuming they are still alive when this happens. Or, they can build a seawall around the island, or at least their property. Or, they may be planning to sell it in 5 years. That's the benefit of being rich. But this is all deflection on D'Souza's part. Climate science is not determined by what the Obamas do or don't do.
If the data is believed, if it's plausible, if it's even probable, if there's even a 50% chance that that would be the case, real estate properties worldwide on the coast would plummet, and the inland would rise. But the fact that that's not happening anywhere, to my knowledge, tells me this. Real estate agents know it's bullshit. Buyers know it's bullshit. Sellers know it's bullshit. Everybody knows it's bullshit.
Curiously, all those people have no scientific foundation to assess the data. Maybe...
Wait.
The fallacy here is in addressing buyers and sellers as if they are one monolith, all thinking and believing the same thing. First off, sellers might very well want to sell these properties because they know they're holding onto a hot potato they need to get rid of. In any case, you don't need all buyers to want to engage in those transactions, you only need enough to continue to transact and keep values high. So even if 90% of buyers and sellers see these as bad investments, the other 10% can keep their values high. More importantly, it's possible for buyers to make a purchase while knowing that someday rising sea levels may very well render those properties worthless. So long as they, in turn, sell it off for a profit before that happens, it's not a problem for them. In fact, that's how bubbles work. Many of the investors know they're in a bubble, but don't know exactly when it will burst. So they keep playing until the music stops. Or maybe they're wealthy themselves and this is just one more house for them.
But when I'm trying to figure out whether or not something is real, I'm looking at the science and what the experts have to say, and you're looking at whether or not the Obamas are hypocrites, or whether Bloomberg's a hypocrite.
No.
That is not a sound epistemology to determine whether or not the climate is... Okay.
Well, a couple things. First of all, the climate scientists are, and I think this is more true of this branch of science than it is generically true, they're highly interested observers of this phenomenon. Climate science is a massively funded enterprise. It gets gigantic dollars, and the gigantic dollars are aimed at finding a predetermined conclusion.
If all of this money is being spent to reach a predetermined conclusion, then there's no need to keep spending the money. The conclusion has been reached. On the other hand, the oil industry has spent millions of dollars fighting climate action, and have used many of the same misinformation agents as the tobacco industry used to downplay the cancerous effects of tobacco. We now know that ExxonMobil knew about climate change 40 years ago, and yet, they continued their misinformation campaign.
I don't think you're innocent of the idea that researchers get huge grants. Take researchers who get huge grants from pharmaceutical companies. Take researchers
Except this is bull.
This is bull.
Yes, because now the bulk of the world has at least, let's assume that the climate change stuff is BS. The bulk of the world is bought into it and are making efforts to change things, to change the way we live our lives, mostly so we can have a life. But now, wouldn't there be more money in the people who are actually going out to debunk this? This is the sort of conspiracy level thinking that people raise about science all the time. Oh, the money is leading them towards this conclusion. There's money in anything that you can demonstrate to be true. This is why I don't buy into the big pharma conspiracy stuff of trying to keep us sick, et cetera.
Okay.
Because there's money in a cure, there's money in new diseases, there's money in this, there's money in that, there's money.
Where's the money in debunking it? Let's say I have charts right here, and I show you the whole thing is BS. Who's going to pay me?
Good question. Let's start by taking a look at PragerU. They have received more than $6.5 million in donations from fracking industry billionaires Dan and Faris Wilks. And wouldn't you know it? They post a bunch of climate change denial nonsense. And what's this? It looks like Dinesh has been in a PragerU video or two, or several. Speaking of Dinesh, for a minimum of $25,000, an organization can hire him to come and talk. My guess is that whatever he says, if the subject of climate change is involved, it will be the same nonsense he's spewing in this conversation. And there's all of those quote-unquote think tanks who receive funding from the oil and tobacco industry, as well as the Koch brothers. Somehow these organizations also happen to promote climate change misinformation. And then there's the conservative book gravy train. Somehow conservative books, including D'Souza's, become bestsellers through mysterious bulk sales. I guess Joe the plumber really wanted 5,000 copies of Dinesh's book. Yes, that must be the reason these conservative books make bestsellers lists through mysterious bulk purchases.
All those people buying coastal properties that you think are hypocrites.
Why would they pay me?
Because now, if you can demonstrate that it's BS, now their property values go up even more, because now...
That just means they'll give the money to the real estate agents and to the buyers, but how are they going to fund me? How do I benefit?
You're suggesting that people will fund people to do research towards a foregone conclusion that benefits them, unless it's the foregone conclusion that benefits them that I mentioned.
No, I'm saying that it's simple common sense that when there is a proposition that leads to certain... Climate change is a huge industry.
I'm not sure what he's defining as the climate change industry, but clean energy is dwarfed by the fossil fuel industry, which, by the way, still benefits from billions of dollars in subsidies.
It is a multi-billion-dollar industry. You look like a guy like Al Gore. Al Gore's been a government servant his whole life. Do you realize Al Gore has a net worth of $200 million? How do you get $200 million? He got $200 million through climate change.
False. The vast majority of Al Gore's wealth comes from the sale of current TV, of which he was part owner, his shares in and involvement with Apple and Google, some hedge funds, and his lucrative speeches. The real Al Gore boogeymen are on the other side. Oligarchs like the Koch and Wilks brothers fund climate change disinformation. That's where the real money is.
Okay, it's a very profitable business.
Okay.
The debunkers of climate change are sitting in obscure research institutions collecting a $55,000 salary.
Which I would argue is an ad hominem fallacy that says nothing about whether or not the data...
No, it's not. No, it's not ad hominem fallacy.
It is.
It's pointing to the fact that research is not disinterested.
Correct, but the real culprit is the quote-unquote research that is little more than a template of false facts and non sequiturs, which is what Dinesh has provided in this conversation.
That's not an ad hominem
Al
point.
Gore's not doing research. The fact that he can profit off something is independent from what researchers are finding out. You don't get to shame researchers because they made some
No. But I'm saying the researchers profit in a huge way too. Look at climate scientists and look at the money that goes into the
I will invest.
Who are these climate change scientists that are living it up, partying with Jay-Z? All Dinesh can do is muster Al Gore, whose wealth comes from things completely unrelated to climate change.
Investigate how much climate
but when you said something else as well, which I think reflects a lack of understanding of markets, which is you said the real estate agents, the stock market, the real estate appraisals, those people are not scientists, right? Those people may not be scientists, but they are in the business where they put their money where their mouth is.
It's Dinesh who is demonstrating a lack of understanding when it comes to markets. As I explained earlier, D'Souza is treating real estate actors as a monolith. The majority of buyers could very well know to stay away from coastal properties on the east. You just need enough dupes to keep the prices high, even if they are in the minority. And more likely, they know that at some point the values of these properties will tank, they just expect to sell them off at a profit before that happens. That's how bubbles work.
All I'm trying to say is that here is an issue that is transporting itself into the domain of public policy. So it's not an issue of pure science. This is not like, was Einstein right that E equals mc squared, and we can send somebody to go look at an eclipse and verify verify that Einstein's prediction was true. That's an argument in the domain of pure science.
That's not true. The discovery that energy equals mass times acceleration had some impact on the direction of government R&D spending. We certainly didn't send a man to the moon, based merely on Newtonian physics.
Now we've moved from what the data show about what is happening to what we should do about it. And there, I think there's plenty of room for disagreement, discussion, everything else.
That's where the disagreement's occurring. It's not occurring over, if you're telling me that the Earth has warmed by 1 degree over the last 100 years, I grant that to you. I say, what have you really shown me so far?
And what about the fact that we're on track to warm the planet another few degrees? Dinesh is cherry-picking what he'll accept. He is playing hide the ball.
And these are the same, by the way, these are the same climate scientists who told us, the same climate scientists who told us in the 70s and 80s that the Earth was cooling. Yes.
The same guys in the 70s?
Well, I mean,
Are they like 84 now?
Well,
like,
okay, fair enough.
All right.
The old global cooling hat trick. Actually, the idea that the Earth would be cooling was never in the majority. There were only a handful of peer-reviewed articles predicting cooling, and they were far outnumbered by the papers predicting the Earth would be warming. What you can find are newspapers and other articles from popular but non-scientific sources publishing these claims. This is where science literacy comes into play. It's important to understand the difference between what's being published in scientific journals versus popular media, which benefits from shocking headlines, especially in today's clickbait-dominated news cycle. For added effect, let's bring in the big guns on this one.
Use as sources.
But you can go back to the 70s and find other doomsday predictions, like global cooling.
But again, what's that got to do with climate researchers? Never mind the predictions made by movies, books, magazines, and individuals with the scientific acumen of Cheese Whiz. Let's deal with the predictions of real, actual climate researchers as published in the scientific literature. Isn't that what you're trying to prove is wrong? The vast majority of published papers in the 1960s and 70s were predicting warming, not cooling, by a margin of 44-7. And the reason they gave for this predicted warming was increasing levels of CO2.
Due to our release through factories and automobiles every year of more than 6 billion tons of carbon dioxide, which helps air absorb heat from the sun, our atmosphere seems to be getting warmer.
This is bad?
Well, it's been calculated a few degrees rise in the Earth's temperature would melt the polar ice caps.
That isn't a recent propaganda message from Greenpeace, it was an educational film shown in schools and colleges in 1958. And of course those predictions have proved 100% accurate. Ice sheets, glaciers and sea ice are melting, and the rate of melt is accelerating. Temperatures have been rising to record levels, even when increased pollution and lower solar output should have been sending temperatures lower. And while we all tend to focus on atmospheric temperatures, remember that climate scientists look at the Earth as a whole. 90% of the extra heat is going into the oceans, which have also fulfilled the predictions of warming. The only thing climate models can't do is predict short-term changes, because in the short term there are lots of minor fluctuations that affect measurements like temperature and sea level. It's like me trying to predict on January the 1st in Denver whether the temperature on February the 1st will be warmer or colder. It's almost impossible. But looking further into the future, it gets easier, and I can confidently predict that the temperature in Denver will be higher in May and much higher in July. That's because over short periods of time, the increasing warming of the sun may not overcome short-term fluctuations. But over a longer period of time, these background fluctuations become less significant. And while temperatures may go up and down on a daily or even weekly basis, I can confidently predict that every month in Denver between January and July is going to be warmer on average than the previous one. So what climate models can do, and have done very successfully, is predict the long-term trend. When geologists applied the model to the past 500 million years, it fit almost perfectly with the continuous changes in the Earth's climate. Geologists discovered that changing levels of carbon dioxide explained nearly all the long-term changes in temperature. The model explained the so-called faint sun paradox. That's the problem of why the Earth was much hotter than today at a time when the sun was much, much weaker. It was because CO2 levels were many times higher than today. The model explained why the Earth escaped from a deep freeze during the Precambrian. It was because of a slow accumulation of carbon dioxide from volcanoes. The model explained why the Earth has maintained a Goldilocks climate ever since, because as the sun has been getting increasingly hotter, the high levels of carbon dioxide have gradually been taken out of the atmosphere and buried as limestone, coal and oil. And the models solve the problem of why the Earth warmed so much after each glaciation, given that the increased insulation that sparked them wasn't strong enough to melt the ice sheets. In fact, the climate model works so well that carbon dioxide is being called the Earth's thermostat and the long-term regulator of the Earth's climate. We even understand the mechanism by which carbon dioxide can do this. It's in peer-reviewed research papers going back over 100 years, when it was first discovered that carbon dioxide absorbs long-wave radiation. And a physicist calculated as far back as the 19th century that if the carbon dioxide level ever got high enough, it could affect the Earth's climate. Talk about a prescient prediction. So, notwithstanding the fact that Al Gore and assorted environmentalists often make wacky predictions that are wrong, as far as researchers in the field of glaciology, atmospheric physics, oceanography, geology, paleoclimatology, and all the other assorted disciplines that have built up this model are concerned, this myth is confirmed.
Fair enough. So you're telling me now that even though we're measuring the same duration, i.e. not 1980 to now, but let's just take, for example, the Earth from 1900 to 1980. You're telling me that there's a whole group of scientists at top universities. There's a book by Lowell Ponty in the 70s called The Cooling. All the apocalyptic rhetoric of today is duplicated in that book with the sole exception that the Earth is cooling. It's not getting hotter, it's getting colder. Global cooling.
Lowell Ponty, by the way, is not a climatologist nor a scientist at all. And if you omit human CO2 output from the equation, it's possible that the Earth would be cooling given the fact that solar irradiance is decreasing. In other words, human CO2 output is not only resulting in rising global temperatures, it's likely offsetting an otherwise cooling trend. As for the actual content of Ponty's book, I'm not going to take D'Souza's word in regards to what data sets he was using. It should be obvious by now that accuracy isn't a priority for D'Souza. He's just here to score rhetorical points for the team.
In fact, I think this is the root of the substitutionary phrase climate change, because the climate somewhere, in some way, is always
false. In the world of science, it's always been called climate change. The phrase global warming was a popular media term. Again, let's bring in the big guns for more explanation.
No, first of all, they started with global warming because they wanted to focus on CO2, and they started talking about climate change.
That's why they call it climate change now and not global warming.
No, it goes back a lot further than that. The conclusion that CO2 concentration affects global temperature was made 120 years ago and confirmed in the 1930s and 40s. In the 1950s, it became known as the carbon dioxide theory of climatic change, or climate change for short. This paper was written in 1955. That's why back in the 1980s we saw the formation of something called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The term global warming describes the global warming that causes this climate change.
changing. But the point is this, that all these measurements from 1980 going back the previous 80 years show a cooling trend. So you're telling me that they were wrong, and the new guys coming in...
I'm not telling you anything.
Well, I'm just saying that you're accepting now that a new bunch of guys will come in measuring the same phenomenon, right? Maybe using better instruments.
That's how science gets better, yeah.
Yes, but it gets better by and large by greater precision.
Do you
Not
think,
by basically saying that up is down and down is up.
Okay, so D'Souza is claiming that the data has actually changed. Is that true? Well, I'm not going to waste money on Ponty's book, but we can look for scientific papers that were published in the 70s and compare their graphs with what science agencies are showing us today. And what do you know, they are perfectly compatible. The y-axis from the 70s graph has less variability, so the spikes look more severe, but the data is pretty much in line. We see an overall heating trend with a small cooling trend that began in the 1950s and ended in the mid to late 1970s. So it's understandable that a minority of climate scientists might have believed that this would continue in perpetuity. But the important thing to note is that the data, contrary to D'Souza's claim, was not changed.
Sure, but if you find, so there's, and I have no specific expertise, hey, fine, in this particular, the thing is, this is the, science got it wrong before, so it likely has it wrong again, which is a fallacy in itself. Because the fact that, the only thing in the entire...
let's probe that fallacy. Why is it a fallacy?
Because the past doesn't necessitate the future.
Right.
And the fact that something, we discovered that science was wrong about something, doesn't mean that our new discovery is wrong or as likely to be wrong or anything in the neighborhood. Science is the single most consistently reliable method for accurately understanding the world.
The natural world.
And the only thing that has ever come along to correct a flawed finding in science is more and better science. not religion, not hypocrisy, not what's the market doing.
But that's silly because that's, okay, that would be like me saying, science is greater than philosophy because scientific findings are cumulative and they have gotten more precise and accurate about the natural world, whereas in philosophy we haven't advanced all that far past Plato.
No, it's nothing like that. But nevertheless, this is where the climate change portion of the conversation ends. From here, they turn to the religion debate, which was really the point. In any case, Dinesh D'Souza's arguments are a perfect microcosm of climate change denial in general. It's not based on science. It's a set of talking points that includes various logical fallacies and numerous outright false statements. That's it for now. Until next time.